Hello, my name is Anisah Husman. I'm a student in the Global Environmental Health class with Dr. Caravanos. In this presentation, we will be discussing mercury contamination in Minamata, Japan. The purpose of this presentation is to understand what Minamata disease is and how it occurred, describe the environmental impact of mercury contamination, and discuss the lifelong effects that occurred as a result. First, we will discuss exactly what happened. Then we will establish a timeline of events. After, the environmental impact and restoration process will be outlined. Then we will talk about the victims and how they were compensated for the tragedy. What happened? The Minamata tragedy occurred in Japan in May 1956. As the map in the bottom right corner shows, Minamata City is located on the water in the south of Japan. The people of Minamata City depended heavily on the nearby sea as it was their main source of food and income. A nearby factory, Chezo, was using mercury as a catalyst for a reaction to synthesize a chemical product. Once that mercury was used, it was discarded as methyl mercury and emptied into the nearby sea. The high mercury levels in the sea caused the fish to have a higher than average mercury content. Unknowingly, the people from Minamata continued to consume the fish with high amounts. Here is a timeline that shows the events we will discuss in chronological order. In 1932, Chisholm began to produce acetaldehyde and used mercury as a catalyst for his operation. In 1956, high concentrations of mercury were found in the sea and the first patient with mercury poisoning was identified. By 1968, the government declared that Chisholm was responsible for the mercury that causes Minamata disease. Chisholm stopped using mercury in the production of goods. After much fighting, the population finally got compensation for the pain and health conditions they suffered. In 1973, a compensation agreement was signed between the patients affected by Minamata disease and Chisholm. In 1978 is when the public began work to clean up the mercury from the sea. In 1986, sludge dredging, which is the process of cleaning up sediment from the water, began. By 1988, this process was completed. By 1992, the sea was completely cleaned and mercury levels returned to normal. The graph depicts the content of mercury found in fish in the Minamata Bay over the years. At the highest point in 1960, just after the public was made aware of mercury contamination, fish were found to have 11.9 parts per million of mercury on average. This is way above the 0.4 parts per million regulation standard for food containing mercury. In 1968, Chisholm completely stopped using mercury and dumping it into the sea, which is where we can see that the levels of mercury started to steadily decrease. By around 1990, the levels were consistently under 0.4 parts per million. In addition to the high levels of mercury in fish, the water in the bay was suffering from high rates of sludge containing this mercury. After the disaster, there were lots of efforts made in order to clean and restore Minamata Bay. The first thing to take care of was the sludge, which contained the bulk of mercury content. Another company, called the Kumamoto Prefecture, helped to remove the layers of sediment from the bay. From 1974 to 1990, about 1.5 million cubic meters of sludge were removed. The last column in the chart pictured shows how much sludge was removed from the landfill and the dredged area. An additional 2 million cubic meters of area around the bay were treated for mercury contamination. Even after cleaning the water, the people of Minamata were still skeptical about the fish swimming in the bay. Chisholm placed a net in the water to capture any fish in the area that could still be contaminated and dispose of them. After 14 years, the bay was finally clean and could be used again without worry. An exact number of how many people were affected by Minamata disease is still unknown. However, we can estimate this number by looking at the data from the lawsuits that followed the event. As seen in this chart, around 200,000 people were living in areas affected by Minamata disease. There were several lawsuits and policies that followed this event. The first was the normal Minamata lawsuit that settled outside of court, where 3,174 people were involved. The Special Measure Act, which was to ensure steps were taken to prevent pollution in the future, had 53,156 people involved. Relief was offered to 11,152 people affected under the political statement. Finally, 2,282 were offered financial compensation through a certification system. This chart shows the number of people who have applied for and gotten certified as victims of the Minamata Bay disaster. Over the years, people have filed as victims in order to get financial compensation for their troubles. The number fluctuates from year to year as people are taken off the waiting list and gain certification. Some people also file repeatedly throughout the years even after being denied several times. After the political resolution in 1995, the amount of people filing for certification virtually disappeared, as this act was meant to be a comprehensive solution for the victims. In total, there have been 20,321 applications to the certification system. Mercury contamination caused by a major factory dumping waste into a nearby water source caused a health condition called pneumonia disease. Contamination of this major water source caused detrimental defects to the environment and people that depended on it. Restoring the water took lots of effort and happened over the course of almost 30 years. People who suffer from this environmental disaster are still recovering financially and are still dealing with the health effects to this day. Here are the references used, and thank you so much for listening to this presentation.